Welcome to season 2, episode 10 of the mixtape with Scott. Not only is this the 10th episode of the season, which feels like a special number, it's also the 44th episode of the entire podcast. Some might say 44 is a rare number because it only happens one time between 0 and 100. So let's stop and celebrate what a special day it is today to have the 44th episode in this podcast. Who better for it to be with than the guest that we have today? But before I tell you who this guest is that I'm super excited about, we have to pause. Remember these special words by Sue Johnson to get ourselves in the mood, help remember what we're doing here. From her book, Hold Me Tight, 7 Conversations for a Lifetime of Love, which, by the way, is a good book about, you guessed it, love. Adult romantic love. One of the greatest things you can experience in your lifetime. We use stories to make sense of our lives. We use stories as models to guide us in the future, and we shape those stories, and then those stories shape us. What an interesting statement, that stories are like prisms that help us see our own lives. They function as lights to help us guide us into the future. And somehow, and this is the mystery, we shape them. And then they shape us. So the question is, how is this podcast shaping this person's story? And how is this podcast shaping my story? Well, that's what my podcast is about, regardless of whether it ever works. Maybe it's never worked, but that's what it's about. It's about the personal stories of people, usually economists, though every now and then it'll be a non-economist too. And by now, you know, I am probably super into hearing and being changed by their personal story. I talked about them when they were a little kid. And because they're typically professional economists, we talk a lot about school. What were you like as a kid? What did you like to read? What was high school like? Why did you go to college? Why did you major in it? When's the first time you heard of economics? Why did you like that class? So on and so forth, right? We're economists. School's a big part of our life. So to hear this story and then potentially be changed by it requires allocating your attention to this person, noticing their voice, small details that they mention, the things that they hover over, and the things that they leave out. This is a person selecting little bitty things from an infinitely large number of facts, just a handful of details that to them are relevant for kind of giving a broad shape of a life lived until now. So with that said, it's my pleasure today to welcome onto the podcast Dr. Joseph Doyle from MIT. Dr. Joseph Doyle has written many interesting papers to me on foster care, crime, and health. He's one of these people early on that was kind of using very advanced causal methodologies kind of before anybody, particularly the judge fixed effects design. One of those papers became a favorite paper of mine. It was co-authored with Anna Aizer, who was a previous guest last season, professor at Brown, where they studied the effect of being incarcerated as a kid on finishing high school and repeating crimes as an adult. It was a well-done causal study, and like many well-done causal studies, it can be very convincing, and because it is so convincing, it can break your heart. And that paper has always hurt when I teach it and can make me very emotional. Highly encourage that you read it. So welcome our guest, Dr. Joseph Doyle, to the podcast. Give him your attention. Be curious, not judgmental, to quote Ted Lasso. I am Scott Cunningham. This is the mixtape with Scott. Okay, well, it is my pleasure today to have Joseph Doyle, professor at MIT's Sloan School of Management, here on the second season of the podcast. Joe, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
Well, so before we get started, or this is the way to get started at the beginning, I was just kind of curious, to learn a little bit more about your childhood. Where did you grow up anyway?
I grew up in Scranton, Pennsylvania.
Oh, okay.
Famous for Joe Biden and The Office, I suppose.
Yeah. Yeah. What did your mom and dad do?
My father was an elementary school principal, and my mom was a teacher, and then she moved to sell insurance.
Oh, wow. Was she a teacher in his school?
No,
No, that would have been
it's
awkward.
the same school district,
Yeah,
Scranton's
same
not that
school.
big.
That's right. That's right. Um, did your dad, was he a principal for like most of his career, or did he sort of what's the career path for a principal? Do you want to be a superintendent
He
or
was a
something?
middle school history teacher, and then he moved to be an elementary school principal. Yeah, and
Okay.
as I was like, as soon as I was born, before I was born, he was a principal, so he's always a principal to me.
Okay. And do you have any siblings?
Yeah, I have three sisters, three older sisters, so I'm the youngest of four.
Okay. Does your family still live in Scranton?
Yeah,
Yeah. So you
yeah. So
drive
we go
back.
there. I live in Boston, so it's like a 5 hour drive. So it's not too bad.
Okay. Okay. So you drive. So it's like it's this famous town now because of the office.
Everyone who I tell I from Scranton, yeah, it was definitely the office for many years. Now Biden comes up a lot too.
He comes up a lot too. Okay, that's cool. Well, so when you were a kid, I was just kind of curious. Was there a vacation that you went on as a kid that you sort of have a fond memory of?
Well, we'd go to the Jersey Shore, and I loved going there. My Before we would go, I couldn't sleep the whole night. Like I was just so excited to go to the Jersey Shore. We went to Cape May, New Jersey, and I loved swimming in the ocean there and going to the arcade across the street. And I don't know, we just had such a good time going on these like 1 or 2 week vacations every summer.
Oh, that's cool. So, what's the water like? Is it pretty clear up there, or is it warm in the summer?
Yeah, it's warm, and I mean compared to New England, it's balmy. Compared to Florida, it's cold, but
Yeah,
I liked it. Yeah, and
yeah,
my dad taught me how to ride waves, body surf essentially. So you jump with the wave, and he was really good at it. Like when he would do it, and like all these kids like would run around and like, oh, how do you do that? And then he taught me how to do it, and I still love doing it today.
yeah. Oh, that's cool. That's cool. So, if I could have had like if I could have peeked on your kind of like elementary, middle school years, what kind of kid were you? What were your hobbies?
Well, I would play baseball every day in the summer, where I just walk to the playground and my friends would be there. Sometimes we play basketball, but usually we played baseball. And then I got into tennis when I was in late elementary school. So I started playing that and biking to the public tennis court a lot. Um, yeah, I I was I joke with my kids. I just left the house in the morning and came back when the lights came on the street lights come on. That's when you have to go home.
Right, right.
It's very different than now, when everything's organized.
Yeah,
Sporting events are organized. It's very important to me. So I just like to go to the playground, and there'd be my friends would be there.
yeah, yeah. That's right. That's right. There was like that was the focal point was the playground. I know it's funny. I grew up in Mississippi, and that's exactly what it was like for me too. Just riding my bike everywhere. It was wonderful. What was Scranton like when you got into high school? Did it ever have any drug
I had a
problems?
fantastic high school. Pardon me?
Did it ever have any drug problems, Scranton, when you were in high school?
I mean, like every high school, there are kids who use drugs,
It wasn't. Yeah. Okay.
but I don't I don't think it was like disabling. We had two high schools, well, three, but where I lived, you could choose between two. One was a tech school where you learn trades, and then there was an academic school
Hmm.
for college prep. So I went to the college prep one,
Hmm.
and then interestingly, my school closed when I was a junior, and they consolidated the tech school and the academic school. We all had to move over to the tech school, the physical location. So it was my uncle who went to the tech school and always joking with me about, because I like school, as you might imagine.
Yeah.
So he's like, "Oh, now you go to my alma mater now."
Yeah. Yeah. So, what did you like in high school? What were the subjects you liked?
Well, I think I didn't really like school until I got to high school,
Hmm.
and when I was a freshman, I don't know if I got lucky or not, but I had really great teachers, like
Hmm.
one after the next. So my favorite teacher was this Mr. Festa, who taught um, civics, government, and he was hilarious, and he treated us like adults, and the material was really interesting, thinking about limits of government or
Hmm.
um, thinking about politics for the first time, but with this really funny teacher. And, he really was super engaging, and that got me really interested in school. And then, I really liked my science teacher, even though that material was boring, if I remember. And then the math program was really good. So we had a math teacher who taught Latin, and she was very strict. But over the course of the year, she would melt into like someone that you really got along with. So it was a great learning environment. In fact, she used to have you go to the board and do a problem. She would give you the problem, and as soon as you made a mistake, she would throw chalk, so chalk would just explode next. And so as I got to know her and we liked each other, I decided I would have to have chalk at the ready. So she made a mistake one time. She went to reach for the eraser, and then boom, like I had thrown the chalk. And then she looked around to see who did it, and she started chuckling at that point, because she was already like, it wasn't like I was being rude. It was just a
Right.
a
That
funny
was like that. Doing everything it softened. Yeah. That's awesome. So, but that's funny you mentioned that guy. So, but it's funny you mentioned both of them, both of these kind of teachers that were sort of kind of had all this like soft skill kind of this ability to kind of connect with you. But then that one professor you mentioned, he was talking to you about economic topics. You mentioned like limited government, but it was you said it was civics.
Civic, yeah, it was like history. Our first history, actually, it was history and civics together. I don't know why they put these together. It was like growth of Western civilization and civics. I don't know why, what in the infinite wisdom of what to teach freshmen, that came up as like probably some requirement that we had to have civics at some point during our years. So we started with cave people, and then ended up with the U.S. presidents or something. But I should say another thing. I had a drama teacher, and Mrs. Langen, and she was the head of our speech and debate club, and she was kind of a legend in Pennsylvania speech and debate. And our high school would win the state championship almost every year. And that included a play that we put on in the fall, and then a competition throughout the year for various speech events and debate events. So I did debate, and she had a big influence on me as well.
Well, what was so influential about her? How are you different?
Well, I took her class a couple times, drama, so you'd have to get up in front of people, and I give myself. I'm not a great public speaker, but I'm not nervous, and I give her a lot of credit for getting me, shedding any kind of real nerves about speaking in public. And that's a real skill, because it's, a lot of people say, they rank that up there as one of the most fearful things to do. But since I had to get up in front of people like weekly to do some kind of dialogue or something, it just got me out of my shell. And now I'm a teacher, right? So it just comes in really handy to just be super comfortable in front of a crowd.
Right. That would not have been something that you say like you would have enjoyed, like absent practice or something like that.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. I learned how to do
it. Oh, that's interesting. Did you hear of anything like economics when you were in high school?
Yeah. So when I was in debate, we had a debate coach who taught us some economics, because I was in policy debates, and there was often a sort of a cost benefit comparison. And so we would think, what kind of language would you use to describe that? And economics came in. In fact, we had a program in the summer that would at the University of Scranton that attracted people from the area to learn how to debate. And they would teach. They had a few lectures in economics as part of that summer. So I remember learning about comparative advantage, maybe a little causal inference, but mostly it was micro theory and thinking about how to think about welfare.
What did you think about that when you heard it? Was it like when you were that young, was it just like one of a million things you were learning about, or did it sort of stand out as a little bit more interesting than the other things?
Yeah, I give a lot of credit to that for my interest in economics to begin with. Basically, my people who went to high school before me would teach in this, and they were now at college, and they would teach us some of the cool things I learned in economics 101 kind of. like I
Mhm.
said, comparative advantage or even demand. Where does demand come from, and how do you think about consumer surplus? So, yeah, it just struck me as like a logical way of thinking about public policy evaluation.
Yeah.
And so I went to college really loving this idea of policy evaluation. That was like something I got a big kick out of. So I wanted to learn the tools to do that.
So your
It would
interest
seem
in,
like if you looked at me now, you would say that I charted like the perfect straight line. It's never like that, right? But
yeah.
somehow there were the seeds were planted early.
Yeah. So you're one of these economists that, like public policy was kind of the horse pulling the wagon a little bit. Like you were first and foremost interested in policy.
Yeah, absolutely.
How come?
In
What
fact,
is it about? Go ahead.
I went to Cornell undergrad, and my major was this policy analysis major, which now
Oh,
they actually named the department now policy analysis and management. So I
yeah.
was one of the early policy analysis students at Cornell.
Yeah. Did you have a sense in high school that those math courses were probably going to be useful if you were interested in policy? Or was that just sort of like you weren't thinking a lot about math back then?
In high school, I took the usual math with calculus at the end. I just thought that was sort of the course to go through. I hadn't really thought about applying it so well to policy analysis at that point. But
Well, what drew you to policy? Why is it, it's funny when I think about the University of Chicago, which we're going to get into in a minute, because of my interest in Becker, for a long time, I was just interested in this pure behavioral positive economics. And it's funny, I taught this history of economic thought class in the fall, and we went from Adam Smith to Marx. And, the thing that really surprised me was how really behavior isn't really what unites the classical economists as much as an interest in public policy. That the economists have always been, interested in kind of fixing things. And so, why did you? What is it about public policy that that's always drawn you to it? Because you could have said, you were interested in all kinds of stuff, causal inference or anything, but what is it about public policy that appealed to you from such an early age?
well, I've just always been really interested in what programs help people and which ones are wasteful. Like
Mm.
basically, I want to improve people's lives, but then you have to measure what works and what doesn't. And there's so many good policy questions. I mean, there are other ways to help people too through private business and so on, but somehow government policy, there's a lot of debates about what should we do. And I thought economics gave you the framework to actually think about it in a logical way.
Mm.
And that excited me at an early age. And, it's never sort of left me. Now, Becker, I went to Chicago partly because of Becker.
Oh, really?
And when you think about economics of crime,
Yeah.
that's a very public policy question, very interesting one. Or maybe we'll get it into it. But I'm studying child welfare, child protection. There are some things that it's really hard to know the answer to. So, like, how aggressive should we be in policing crime, or how aggressive should we be in protecting children? If you are really aggressive and you investigate every family for child abuse and neglect, you're going to be taking a bunch of kids away from their parents, and so there's a cost to that. And then if you leave too many kids at home, then they're going to be kids abused and neglected. And so I honestly don't know the answer but I think it's an extremely important question. So how can we start to think about that? There are various lenses to look at it, but I've always thought economics it just clicked with me as a way to logically explore questions like that.
Even at Cornell, this started to emerge at Cornell that I want to go
Yeah,
and.
my honors thesis at Cornell was in foster care.
Oh, wow.
And trying to estimate a supply curve for foster parents was what I could get data for, and
Oh,
estimate
that's
something
interesting.
in
So,
undergrad.
so how did you get interested in foster care? How did that even happen?
Well, um, I got a fellowship at Cornell called the Cornell Tradition, and they would subsidize work. Um, And so I had a bunch of RA jobs. And then in the summer, they would give you a little extra money because they expect if you're going to go work for a think tank or a policy institute or something, you're not going to make the money that you would normally make. So they actually made up for the fact that you're not going to work as a lifeguard or something. And so it was a great program to like really encourage work. And one summer, actually, I was assigned, this is like my sophomore year, I was assigned to look into international adoption policy and how it's evolved over time and what are the trends and so on. And once I started looking into that, I was thinking about adoption. And once you start thinking about adoption, you start thinking about other ways, pathways into adoption, and foster care is one of them. So this was pretty early on in my undergrad. And then it turns out that Cornell is a great place to do child welfare research. They have an institute there now that's grown out of their natural interest in foster care. It's like the national warehouse of data on foster care.
Yeah, that data
it's
set. What's that data set? Is it AFCARS? Is there?
Well, there's NCANS.
NCANS
Is the one that they store, which is a child abuse and neglect data set, and
Yeah.
then they have AFCARS.
Did you use NCANS for any of your have you ever used NCANS for any of your research? We got it
I
one
haven't.
time, but I never used it. I remember that now. I haven't thought about that in years.
Yeah, I've used it. I don't think I've ever published on it, but I
Yeah,
got access to it. I was looking at what I could answer with it.
right.
I never came up with a good enough idea to use
Yeah,
it with statistical precision.
right.
That's kind of
Right.
the fun part about research, right? You have 100 ideas and 5 of them are going to work, or 10 of them might work. So I had plenty of ideas for NCANS, but I never got a paper out of it.
Yeah.
I guess in my thesis, I used I hand collected data on monthly payments made to foster parents by state year over some panel, and then I collected foster care placement rates, like share of the population in foster care, and I basically regressed one on the other, and I called it a supply curve. So,
Yeah, right, right.
I had actually a little structural model. It's funny, I don't do structural economics, but I had a little, price theory model, and
Oh,
there were
yeah?
shortages. So with a shortage, if you raise the wage, you'll trace out the supply curves.
Oh,
And
yeah,
so it's like a
sure.
nice little model, but
That's
yeah,
nice. Wait, yeah. So wait, there was a shortage of of who? Of
foster parents,
of foster parents.
no, foster parents.
Of foster parents.
And then I had the wage that they offer the foster parents. And as
Oh,
you
and then
raise
it
the
went up.
wage, since you're on the supply curve, you're going to just
Right.
trace up. And it was upward sloping. So, it must be a supply curve, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Well, do you remember what the elasticity was?
I think it was 0.3.
Huh. Has anybody ever done it?
But that's you're straining my memory and my abstract and my
Yeah,
analyses. I did
I
publish
made
it
a
with.
promise not to make you remember any numbers. Well, I wonder if anybody has done that before. Has anybody estimated the supply curve for foster cares? Have you ever seen that? I mean, you're the expert. I actually haven't.
I've seen other people do similar things, and yeah, I think not quite the way that we did it with like this little structural model and like a reason why we might think it does supply.
Yeah.
It does trace out a supply curve.
Uh-huh.
It's hard to get variation in what we pay foster parents. That's beyond this sort of state year numbers. Those are pretty crude because the payments will vary a lot by the type of case. And so then if you see the payments are going up, then the cases are probably changing. So actually my crude measure is probably pretty clean because it was like a median number.
Right.
That probably wasn't so affected by that. But if you go into the micro data and you start to try to correlate these things, which I've seen done, it's not very convincing because it's so tied into the type of case.
Got it. Got it. So you end up at Cornell, even though you don't major in economics, there's something happens at Cornell because you're like, you mentioned Becker. You want to go to Chicago, or you just kind of apply everywhere, and Chicago's the one that you end up choosing, or was it you were really kind of were wanting to go to Chicago?
Well, I loved Chicago. I loved Becker's research in undergrad,
Okay.
and the person I RA'd for, Dean Lillard, went to Chicago, and so he was always kind of an evangelist for Chicago, and Becker. So anyway, I was definitely read a ton of Becker and undergrad, and then I applied everywhere. The New York Fed, between the under micro section of the Fed, so it wasn't a macro job, but it was in the research department.
Right.
And then I applied everywhere, and the best place I got into was Chicago.
Yeah, yeah. So I know a lot about Chicago and nothing about Chicago at the same time. Chicago was the thing that got me to want to become an economist, and it was reading Becker, and it was reading the law and economics papers that that were sort of stored there in that tradition. But I was curious, if you remember, if you could kind of just, for the sake of like a young student that's listening, or even a PhD student now that, doesn't know what it's like to go to Chicago in 1998. What was it like what was it like as you sort of stepped into Chicago in 98? How would you describe what it felt like?
Well, Chicago had a tough reputation. It was very tough to go to grad school there. People fail the first year,
Yeah.
which a lot of other programs do not fail people the first year. At least that's the reputation. So they said, you in some previous years, not too long before I got there, half the students would fail. They would actually let tons of students into the program, and then they'd fail half of them. And then, that's a tough way to start your grad school career. Now, when I got there, they had reduced it a little, so the size wasn't. They ended that experiment to some extent, but we were still on the high end in terms of the size, and there was still this threat that 20-30% of kids were going to fail.
Yeah.
So that definitely put a lot of pressure on. And then that's the most work I've ever done is that first year. They just load you up with tons of work that you have to get done, and there's not enough time to do it, and so you just work all the time.
Right.
And so it's and you want it to at the end of the year, it's quite rewarding that you've just it seems like a major accomplishment. Like you are smarter at the end of that year.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
But you put your nose to the grindstone for a year and doing anything all day, every day. You're going to be good at it at the end, and
right.
feel a sense of accomplishment.
Yeah. So you were in that.
It wasn't fun. It wasn't fun.
Yeah. So you were in that famous Becker Murphy price theory class. What was that like?
I love that class.
What was it like? What was Becker like as a professor?
Charming, and obviously there are only certain people when they're helping you discover something that you're just really enjoying the ride of trying to figure it out. And then he has his own quirks, like he can't read his handwriting, and so we'd all kind of make fun of that, and it made you pay attention more because you could never catch up later to see what he wrote because you had no idea.
Did you ever throw chalk?
So that's actually a technique.
Did you ever throw chalk at Gary Becker when he made a mistake?
No chalk was thrown.
Oh, really? Okay, you're not supposed to do that.
It was in this really cool auditorium with leather seats, and it was
yeah.
I don't know. It's just you knew that I think Knight had taught the course and Friedman had taught the course, and now it was Becker and Murphy, and then it's just this long history of 301. It was fun to be there. And then in the middle of the lecture, he would ask a question, and then he'd start looking down the list of student names, and then he'd call a name and cold call on you. So as he's looking down that list, everyone's like, my heart anyway would be pounding a little. Like, I wonder if he's going to ask.
Right. What are your memories of Kevin Murphy? How was he similar, and how was he different from Becker in that class? What was it like? Price theory 1 and 2 or something?
It was 301. Chicago's on a quarter system, so there are 3 courses in micro in the first year, and they were the first. So they were like, September till Thanksgiving or something.
Yeah.
And Becker and Murphy was, again, super smart and clearer. Everything was very clear.
Yeah.
In fact, it was so clear that afterwards you were like, that was really easy. And then if you asked to explain it, like you had trouble explaining it because you could never do it as well as him. One of those, it was so obvious. The way he said it was so obvious, and later on it didn't seem as obvious. Whereas Becker, you had to think. They were hard questions, and he didn't write clearly, and you had to sort of stick with him. So it was a different style.
Yeah.
Uh,
Well, when you got there, so what's it like at Chicago? What was it like at Chicago for you in sort of this like matching process with both your research, but also the matching process with your advisor? What was that like for you? You know, was it something that like, it took you a long time, or I mean, because you graduated really fast, so I'm assuming didn't take you a long time, but what was that process like?
well, I went in really interested in family, child welfare, family
Yeah.
economics, and so who better than economics to the family Becker
Right.
to step in to just pick his brain. And then he taught a human capital class with a lot of the rotten kid theorem and a lot of family economics, human capital
I didn't put
formation.
that
So
together.
my
I
field
did
course
not.
with him was fantastic.
So wait, he's your advisor?
No, in fact, that's one of the things I've regret is not having him on my committee. I ended up having Steve Levitt as my advisor,
Oh, okay.
who was very welcoming and a very nice. You could just tell he was a very nice guy, and he was going to guide me. Um, I probably shouldn't have thought this because a lot of people worked with Becker, but um, I always thought maybe if I'm not at the top of the class, Becker's, used to working with the top students,
Mhm.
and I was not in the top of my 301. I wasn't asked to TA micro. I was
Mhm.
asked to TA econometrics, so we have this common interest in econometrics,
Yeah.
and that's where I shined more was in econometrics,
Uh-huh.
but not so much in micro. But I loved micro, so I would meet with him quarterly maybe to talk about my research, and so I felt like he was an advisor, but not he wasn't somebody who signed my or wrote a letter for me.
It's so interesting
But
because that foster care is such a blend of his work on crime and his work on family, but I can't remember hearing him talk much about it. Like thinking because in so you've got basically abuse or neglect of children by caregivers or parents, and the government removing them. Even when you were talking earlier, it felt like a real Beckerian framework of like, the costs of the offense, the cost of the abuse and the neglect, and the costs of the removals. And so it seems like, it's funny. I actually hadn't myself, even though I've written about foster care, I hadn't really thought about it I haven't really ever thought about it in a Beckerian framework before. So you were so what did he think about what you were working on?
he loved it, yeah. So we would talk about, he has an altruism model, very
Yeah.
simple model where the utility of the parents and the parents care about the kids' utility, um, and they have a weight on the kids' utility and their own utility, and that weight could be pretty small, or negative if you know. So you can start to think about where does maltreatment come from? What kind of model would you think about for even thinking about maltreatment?
Right.
And then it's economics of crime as
Yeah.
well would be right in there as in terms of deterrence or. Um,
But you fell
but
in.
also remember the Chapin Hall Center for Children is at the University of Chicago, and that's if you were into foster care research as a undergrad, like you knew the Chapin Hall Center for Children, they have a data warehouse there, not only for Illinois, but they had a multi-state data warehouse
Mm,
for foster care. And so the first day I was on campus, I just went there, and I ended up being an employee there, like an RA there from my sophomore year, or maybe even the summer after my first year.
did your dissertation, it was an empirical paper?
Yeah, foster care.
Is
I
it
had
one of
two
the
papers on
papers
foster
that
care.
it's not the AER-JP stuff, is it?
I'm trying to remember now. I definitely no. What it was there was a reform that paid relatives less to take care of foster kids. So there was a policy reform that lowered the wage that they offered relatives to take care of foster kids.
Oh,
So I thought this was a really unique opportunity to learn about altruism
right.
by if one day they're going and saying, "Hey, grandma, would you take the kid for $400 a month?" And then the next day, a different grandma is saying, "Hey, would you take the kid for $250 a month?"
Yeah.
And I found that there was a big drop in the willingness of relatives to take care of kids when they got less money. And then I was curious, would the quality of the foster parents improve or decline? Because you may have a selection of only the ones who either could afford it or love the kid more.
Yeah.
And I found that the quality stayed the same, suggesting that the marginal grandparents, the ones that uh, are influenced by the money, are similar quality to the non-relatives. And it's one of the few papers that tries to compare non-relatives and relatives at all, because it's really hard to compare
Right.
because of the selection into whether you can find a relative to take the kid. But here I had the shock. So anyway, I needed to have an instrument, sample selection instrument, going back to my Heckman
Yeah.
PA job. And the instrument I came up with was a leniency propensity.
Really? Back in
And then,
02?
and then
You had that in
that
02?
made me think. That was back in 02. And then I said, well, I should use this instrument for something that's even more important, which is not just getting into my stupid sample,
Yeah.
but do you go to foster care at all?
Yeah.
And so that was my first real big project when I got out of grad school. Was I have this cool instrument, let me use it. And then I realized that Jeff Kling had used the judge instrument before, like, sort of independently, but I gave him a lot of credit for thinking about how to actually do it and so on. So
Well, what were you
I
doing
was one of the early
different?
propensity guys.
Well, besides using it as a sample selection instrument, how would you say it was different? It was still it was still like a leave one out kind of propensity type thing.
Yeah, it was just I wanted I wanted an instrument for going into foster care, because if you had to be going into foster care to be approaching the grandparents with the wage offer, and that was a selected sample and so on. So I said, okay, well, I need an instrument. And then I just use a control function. So it wasn't it's a less interesting way to use the instrument than in the end, because it was like almost like a robustness check in my dissertation paper.
But it was
But
kind of
then it
stood out in
turned
your
into
mind
like
a
the
little bit.
focal.
But it kind of captivated you a little bit.
Well, I've always been interested in the question of the optimal removal rate and so on. So it wasn't that I wasn't interested in that. It was just that I had this other idea that I needed to solve a problem, sample selection problem. And when I solved that, I said, well, I could use this to answer the question I've always been interested in.
Yeah. So you didn't do that in the dissertation though. That came later.
I'm trying to remember if it ended up that chapter, but I don't think it did.
Yeah.
But it was when I talked to people on the job market, I was like, oh, I'm definitely doing, it. Yeah, it turned out my job market paper was a health paper, but I spent most of my job market interviews talking about child welfare. But of course, they want to talk about your job market paper,
Right.
as well.
Right. Yeah. What did Levitt think about it? I'm sure you're going to tell me super nice. And it sounds like, you probably, what do you think you got out of that relationship with Levitt? So that'd have been like 98 to 02. I mean, it's like way before Freakonomics, but he still got this, strong reputation of being like, kind of like a credibility revolution guy. What did it feel like, kind of looking back? I mean, because in some ways, like he just had such a profound effect on the field of crime. It's not really always appreciated, I don't think, just how disruptive he was in just doing such high quality work in crime. What was it like back then working with him or working under him?
I mean, I was super excited to work with him because I remember he gave a talk in my first year econometric sequence, just like one day Levitt's there and he's talking about how do you come up with research ideas? And it was just like really good advice, about failing quickly and like if you could see a relationship, like if you have an idea in raw data, do you actually see it might work in raw data? And then if it does, then it lowers the risk of spending a lot more time getting better data and so on. So he just had nuts and bolts advice for people. And he came from Cambridge, where people. I'm in Cambridge now. I get the sense then and now that certainly then, the graduate students were treated very well at MIT.
Yeah,
and so he brought that with him to Chicago.
Yeah,
he brought
MIT.
that with him to Chicago. So he's just like one of the nicest professors at Chicago. So like, I just gravitated to that, and then he spent a lot of time with me and helped me a lot learn how
Mm,
to do research. So less about, I took his crime. He had a crime class, um, but it was mostly about how do you answer questions, and it was really, to me, just so supportive that I naturally gravitated toward that.
mm. So was Heckman on your committee?
No,
Uh,
so I TA'd for Heckman. I learned a ton from Heckman. I knew people who were, he was on their committee, and it was known to be a very stressful relationship because you would learn so much, but then you have to convince him that you should be able to graduate now, and he often thought you needed a little more seasoning.
Yeah.
Whereas I think Levitt was a little more hands off. Like when you want to go, you can go.
Mm,
And I was engaged to be married, and I kind of wanted to have my own. Uh, I wanted to have a little more control
right.
over when I could leave.
Right. Right.
I got a lot of research done, and I could leave when I wanted to go.
Yeah. 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 So you and this is going to be random, but in my brain it makes sense. So you and Ed Vicketal, y'all sort of overlapped for a couple of years. Did y'all know each other?
Yeah, sure. He was the TA maybe a year or two before me, and he was super nice guy. And yeah, there was a point in my career, and my wife will attest to this. I had to decide whether to become a Heckman RA or a Levitt RA, and I just went with Levitt. But that was a big decision, and
Yeah.
at the time I was very which way I should go.
Right. Right. Yeah. I've heard other people that having to make that decision. The reason why I asked about Vicketal is, I had never seen anybody do marginal treatment effects until you and so I was just kind of wondering, like, was that like when you decided to do it, was this just kind of, was this something that you were watching a lot of people do, that you had were thinking that this would be valuable to kind of estimate these marginal treatment effects within this leniency design? Or I mean, I'm just curious what it was like, if you sort of learned that at Chicago, or was it stuff that you got later?
No, it's definitely I was in econometrics. One of my fields was econometrics, and it was definitely in the air at the time with Heckman and Bitlissil there, talking about marginal treatment effects. And Pedro Carnero.
Mm,
Pedro taught me the most. I didn't understand the first three times I heard about it. I knew it was interesting, but I was like, I don't understand what they're talking about. And then Pedro walked me through it, and I understood it very well. So
mm,
I give a lot of credit to Pedro. And
mm.
then when you need a continuous instrument, and now they can do it with binary, but I think it's still better with continuous. And so here I had this continuous instrument, and then I realized it was actually a pretty cool setting to do the MTE because the shape of the MTE tells you about the unobservables of the population that you're studying and the complier. So it would just seem like a really cool application of MTE. And I honestly think a lot of people didn't understand what they were talking about either, like the
Yeah.
normal grad student. But I did
Yeah.
because I had studied so often, and I had these mentors like Pedro. Um, and then even the way they had, and I think that I take some pride in like translating what they were doing into like, this isn't that hard. It's actually pretty easy to think about.
Right.
And then I still remember Josh Angrist. Uh, we thought they might have a rivalry with Heckman. I don't know how much rivalry they had or didn't, but for whatever reason, Angrist didn't really like this MTE approach. And then I
Yeah.
pointed out to him that he did the MTE in a very intuitive way in another paper. He didn't call it MTE, but it was still the same thing. And he's like, oh, well, then that makes some sense. So I was
Yeah.
like, the way I see it is very, very reasonable.
Yeah. Bringing peace to the land.
There you go. I think I
Nature's
did.
healing. That's great. Well, so okay. So this work that you end up
I should say Robert Moffett was my editor on the AER paper, and he helped me refine the MTE as well. So like, I definitely wanted to apply it there, but he helped a lot too. So I don't want to.
Yeah. Well, so I don't want to assume that the people listening, sort of are aware of this kind of pair of foster care papers. If you could just kind of give like the elevator pitch about, what those two, that AER, American Economic Review article, and the Journal of Political Economy paper about foster care removal and these outcomes. I was just kind of curious if you wouldn't mind sort of setting it up.
Yeah, absolutely. So the research question is, what is the effect of removing kids from their parents who are suspected of maltreating the kid, removing them and placing them in foster care on long-term outcomes like their earnings and employment as young adults, or their propensity to go into prison as adults. So if you look in the prison population, for example, a quarter of the people in prison had been in foster care as a youth. There's just a very strong correlation there, but it's not obvious that foster care caused that. It's probably the maltreatment that led to foster care and also led to imprisonments. At the same time, I find this research question super interesting. Like, should we place kids in foster care or leave them at home, and which one should we remove and not? So if you just compare kids who went to foster care and those who didn't, then you'd have all this omitted variable bias. The kids who go to foster care have much worse unobservables probably than the kids who are staying at home because they're being maltreated.
Right.
And so I had to come up with an idea. Shocked, some kids are going to go to foster care, some kids won't. And the idea I had
What
was
year
that
is this?
and after speaking,
What year is this when you're working on this for the first time? And you're at MIT?
1999, 2000.
Oh, so
2000.
this is even at Chicago where you're thinking about this removal.
Yeah, because I worked at the Chapin Hall Center for Children, which is the repository for foster care data, and they have a lot of researchers doing foster care research. They had connections with the state of Illinois, their Department of Children and Family Services. So not only did I get access to data, but institutionally, I spoke with caseworkers. I learned how the process worked. How do kids get into foster care?
Right.
So this is the fun part, was listening for variation. Like they'll say, well, most kids go into foster care because of substance abuse by the parents, let's say. So that would be a terrible instrument for foster care placement. It won't be a good shock to foster care placement because parents who are abusing drugs may affect their kids badly in many ways beyond foster care. But then at one point they said, we do an investigation with these investigators. And I said, well, how do the investigators get assigned? And they said that it's on a rotation. They called it the rotation. Well, it's the rotation. Depending on who the next case is, it just gets assigned to the next person. So that made me think, well, that sounds like it could be useful. And so the idea in the research design is that some kids are investigated by investigators who place a lot of their kids in foster care, and other ones are investigated by ones that are less likely to have kids placed in foster care, coupled with this random assignment of the kids to investigators. So you get this random shifter of whether you go to foster care or not. And then I just basically compare kids who are assigned to strict investigators to lenient ones. And I find that if you were just randomly assigned to a strict investigator, you're more likely to go to foster care, as we might expect.
Yeah.
And then you're more likely to end up in prison 20 years later, or you're less likely to be in the workforce. You're more likely to have a teen pregnancy. You're more likely to end up in juvenile justice, juvenile court. Right. And so why would assignment to a strict investigator have huge effects on your later life outcomes? I argue the main way is because they are more likely to have you placed in foster care. And so that's the idea behind the paper, and the sort of
how did that make you feel?
Ability to,
how did that make you feel,
that
result? Because it's such a jarring. I mean, you've been thinking about foster care since Cornell, presumably. I mean, did you have? I mean, you're an empiricist, so you don't have any dog in it necessarily, but like, I could at least imagine you're like, this is an important program. Helping kids, get away from abusive parents is important. So therefore, it will help them. And you're sort of like stuck with this big positive coefficient. What did that feel like? Was that hard for you?
Well, I really didn't know which way it would go. I could have, if you talk with kids in foster care, they hate foster care.
Right.
I mean, a lot of people, if you look at documentaries or you talk with like they don't like foster care.
Right.
Um, and so you hear all these bad stories of foster care was terrible, and then you're like, well, your home life might have been terrible too. So I don't know what the
Yeah.
effect of being placed is. Maybe it's good or bad. I really didn't know. And going back to the policy evaluation, a lot of policies have strong political lenses so that, like, for example, like a minimum wage, I would think Republicans hate it and Democrats like it. Like you kind of know based on the politics. But child protection, kind of all bets are off. Like if you are a small government Republican, you might not want them interfering with family.
Yeah.
At the same time, if you're like a libertarian Republican, they usually say let adults do whatever they want to do, but kids, we kind of have to protect kids. Like there's always this sort of, and so I could have imagined the government going too far and removing too many kids. In this little model I had in my mind, there was asymmetric penalties for the investigators. If they leave a kid at home who gets harmed, they get in big trouble. But if they remove a kid and that kid is worse off 20 years later, like no one's going to pin the blame on them. So like there was this asymmetric incentive to remove too many kids. I thought the moral hazard would go that way. So I actually thought that might be the case. But I honestly didn't know the answer, and I didn't really care. Like I didn't wasn't rooting for an answer.
Right.
If it turned out that the marginal kids were better off, then we haven't gone far enough. If they're worse off, we're probably going too far.
Yeah.
I didn't expect the magnitude. I find these big negative effects of being assigned to a strict investigator and suggesting that placement in foster care has big negative effects in Illinois in the 90s for marginal cases. So I spent a lot of time talking with reporters, trying to explain to them local average treatment effects.
That's good luck. Yeah.
Does not mean foster care is bad for all kids.
Yeah.
It's only for the cases where the investigator assignment matters. And I walked them through very carefully. And then like the USA Today had a headline, MIT study shows foster care is worse than leaving kids at home. And I'm like, that's not what I said.
They're not going to say the foster care is worse for the complier. It's harder to tell that story.
That's a harder thing to sell in a headline.
Yeah, it's harder to sell.
So I actually felt worse about that.
Yeah.
That you might have thought I felt bad about these marginal kids. I actually felt bad about the inframarginal kids who are probably helped by foster care, but my research might be like misused. Because people won't give it the subtlety of the local average treatment effect.
Well, so I mean, this is kind of a good point, though. I mean, you've got these marginal treatment effects, and I'm kind of drawing a blank over if you use your marginal treatment effects to pull out these aggregate parameters, but you could have. Is that what you did in there when you went from the marginal treatment effect to these like average treated on the treated and stuff?
No, I didn't. Actually, I just used the typical instrumental variables to get the overall. And then I found that the MTE graphs were useful to explore where the overall came from. And I had support. The probability that you go to foster care range from 10 to 30%, depending on which kind of investigator you got. And I was always uncomfortable extrapolating out.
Yeah, right.
But what I could say was within the 10 to 30, what I was most interested in was, is there something weird on the margins, or is this basically like whether you go from a 10 to an 11 percentage point placement rate or a 29 to a 30, are they way different than each other? And it turned out they're relatively noisy. I thought it was pretty flat. Like it really didn't matter where in the margin. And that made me think it wasn't unusual. Yeah. It was just right on the knife's edge that this was bad for kids. I thought, no, it's actually bad for kids if you go from 11 to 12 as it is, and 29 to 30. And that suggests if you go from, everybody would agree this kid needs to go to foster care, then obviously those kids are probably helped by foster care. But within this pretty wide range, 10 to 30%, it was bad for kids no matter where. So to me, it was more of a robustness. That's a really cool way to explore that.
Yeah. What was the people's reaction like outside of econ? Like because you're it seems like you've kind of got this connection at this point with like a more interdisciplinary, because of that, you worked with this foster care center. How did they respond to it? Like anybody outside of econ with a strong interest in foster care and child welfare?
Yeah, I speak with a lot of policymakers, child advocates. There's been a big push at that time and continuing to like reduce the number of kids in foster care somehow with more family preservation, more support to families as opposed to removals. And they took my results and ran with them. Basically, they said, hey, this is like a proof of concept that we could be harming kids with the current way we're operating our system. We're harming kids.
Right.
If I found the other result, if I found something different, they would have ignored me. So I like to think of it. I like to be realistic. Like, we find these results, and then the policymakers who want to go a certain direction, they're probably going to latch onto that. But you know, I think we're in the business of just finding out whatever the data tell us.
Yeah.
But one thing I've been sort of, I don't want to be too haughty about it, but like somewhat, I found it rewarding that the research has been used as this kind of proof of concept. Like, we've always said we need to be careful about removing kids, but here we're seeing Illinois in the 90s was doing it in a way that was really harming kids who were on the margin of entry. I think, I've just heard that echoed among the policymakers that speak to me anyway, that my research in economics has made an impact on the child welfare policy world.
Yeah. Is that kind of what you were, and that kind of, even, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but when you were a kid in that policy debate, you did sort of hope that you might have impact. Is that right? Wasn't just the intellectual discussions of policy. You were actually kind of hoping that you would make the world a little bit of a better place.
Yeah, I wanted to inform policy with good evidence, so that's for sure. And then, like I said, I've gotten more realistic over time, that sometimes people want to do something, and then they're going to look for the research that sort of backs up what they're saying. But in my case, hopefully people look at the research and say, no, this is a pretty credible way to go about it.
Right.
Anybody could find data to support their side, but the question is, do you believe their results? And so that's why having the natural experiments that are kind of easy to explain and are, in the end of the day, we're in the business of using data to tell a compelling story, not just any story. So
right. I gotta conclude it, but I just want to end this last thing. So one of my favorite papers, and I'm not just saying this, one of my absolute favorite papers, and I teach it all the time, is your juvenile incarceration paper with Anna Aizer. That's a distressing paper in a lot of ways. It's made me very emotional when I teach it. And I was just wondering, how did you and Anna meet anyway? That seemed like that was just like a perfect, combination, the two of y'all.
Yeah. Well, we had the same fellowship in grad school. The Social Science Research Council had a fellowship that we both applied for somehow, and then they had a retreat with there were some really cool people. Ted Miguel, I think, was there. These are young faculty members that came to help mentor grad students.
Wait, was Anna was at UCLA though, right?
But Anna came to this retreat that she was a grad student, like I was a grad student.
Oh.
So as grad students, we came together for this SSRC retreat. I forget where it was, maybe at Duke or somewhere. And they had these now famous, I think, economists that were very young, maybe first or second year out of grad school, mentoring us a bit and reading our papers. And we'd have like a workshop where we think about our papers. Anyway, I met Anna there. I'm a huge fan of hers since then. And when I got the opportunity, I guess we've just been talking about research projects, and I had this access to this administrative data in Illinois.
Yeah.
And so I forget who came up with the research question, but we definitely thought it'd be fun to work together on that. And then I'm sitting at the MBER today, and I remember sitting here with Anna. Maybe she was here for a year. I was definitely here for a year, and we got a lot of work done, like on a little junior leave, and banged that paper out. It was a really fun time working with her, and it was, like you said, an important question, hard to answer. We had this propensity instrument that we used, like that we were getting good at using that, and
but it's also the linkages, the all of these the courts linked to the high schools, linked to the corrections facility. I mean, that's there's a lot of things when I think about like the growth of the causal inference and stuff, but like one of the things that gets kind of smothered in the growth of like more identification, tight, clean, natural experiment, et cetera. One of the things that people don't see as much is this like huge data sets becoming available is one thing, but then people linking the people across the data sets. And I think that's one of the really cool parts of that paper, was just like you tracking a kid from that juvenile court back to their high school using a completely, was that hard to do to get buy-in from these other agencies like, Cook County ISD or whoever it was?
Yeah, so this goes back to my days at Chapin Hall. So Chapin Hall had relationships, but you still had to apply for the data. I remember, I think for that paper, I flew to Chicago and like there was a stall and whether we could access data, and like I like waited in a waiting room and talked to someone. Like I was like really eager to make it work to get access to that data. So there was effort involved, but I had some expertise in linking data from helping Chapin Hall do that, and so we were standing on the shoulders of their relationships back in Chicago. So that's why a lot of my research is in using Chicago data, because I made those relationships when I was a student there.
Right. Um, the result in that paper that has always really just kind of haunted me is they're less likely to go back to school. But if they go back to school, they are, if you're a kid and you're incarcerated, under this randomized judge design, then you're less likely to go back to high school or school. But if you do, you're going to have an emotional behavioral disorder, right? And that's sort of the result. You're more likely to have that. What was that?
That's right. Yeah.
What if people told, what's that been like to share that, with policymakers? Like, because in this age of mass incarceration, it's funny. You have this great statistic in the paper, which is, the United States also has the highest juvenile incarceration rate. And the one that comes in second is like South Africa, and we're 5 times higher or something. It was some kind of just obscene, statistic.
Yeah.
And just the thought of like the way that paper lends itself is just to think, oh, okay, we're traumatizing the marginal kid is the way I read it. Is that sort of,
Yeah.
what's it been like, to share that with policymakers? Have they been as much, has that been as, you catch people's attention with that kind of thing?
Yeah. So absolutely. There are, again, like I said, with child welfare, there are child advocates. There are also advocates to try to reduce
Yeah.
juvenile incarceration, and they have used our paper to say, hey, the thing is trying to convince tough on crime folks, and
Right.
the fact that we found that you would increase crime was like a big, arrow in their quiver. That like you're not reducing crime, you're actually increasing crime. Now we could get into deterrence and so on, but basically, like you said, the idea that locking kids up traumatizes them, and then most of them won't go back to school, or if they do, we actually see in the data this emotional behavior disorder cropping up. That this institution could be traumatizing these marginal kids.
Yeah.
People understand that actually, and so one of the things that, like you said, talking to grad students and so on, I did a lot of shoe leather research for that type of project. Where when I was a student in Chicago, I visited the juvenile detention facility and met kids there, juveniles there.
Yeah.
I sat through court cases in the juvenile court,
Yeah.
and you just hear like for a few days. And I was recording data for another project, but it was just eye opening.
Yeah.
These court proceedings go through, the level of legal aid that people get was very immature.
Mm.
And then when you go to the Audi home, it was called the juvenile correction facility. It was just very depressing.
Could you sort of like describe like when you were watching, could you describe to me like, oh, so here's an example of a strict judge and here's an example of a lenient judge, like this is the kinds of stuff they did differently? Like, because I've heard stuff on podcasts like the Serial podcast, it was like the 3rd season where there was, or I've seen documentaries where the what appears to be like a strict judge almost seemed like way too micromanagey, like almost kind of a sort of judgmental. And I was curious, like, did you ever kind of feel like you could, like, you had profiles or archetypes of like, this is what in Cook County, like a strict judge looked like versus this is what a lenient judge looked like?
Well, first talking with lawyers in the system, they were not surprised at all that the luck of the draw on which judge is going to come before you will be a big determinant on the punishment. Like that was
Yeah,
like, of course. So
right.
that made me feel really strong about the idea. Like the practitioners are like, it was obvious to them that that would be a big deal.
Yeah, and these
You
judges
randomly
have
got
they
to
have reputations of being
yeah, and
being
some of
certain.
them were prosecutors before, and some of them were defense attorneys
Mhm.
before. A
Mm,
limitation of the paper is we don't know a lot about the judges in terms of characteristics, so we can't really describe them that way. And in fact, some of the research I'm doing now is looking more into can we characterize the judges and so on, but
right.
which I find to be really interesting in its own
Yeah.
right.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um,
Is that probably
but
a
I
feeder
wanted to,
into the strictness and lenience? Is like that whether you were a prosecutor or a defense attorney might sort of predict your kind of habits or your attitudes?
that's the hypothesis. Yeah, like the
Yeah.
prosecutors think all the people are guilty, and the
Guilty.
public defenders are trying to help.
Mm.
That's something to test. I don't know.
Yeah, that's something to test. That's really interesting. Um, well, I we've gone over a little bit, Joe. It is interesting. I didn't realize it. I didn't know what I was gonna hear, but you do have this kind of shoe. You said shoe leather. You can I can hear it in the way that you've approached research questions. It's not just that you're smart. It's not just that you kind of have this natural experiment. Like when you said that you sat down with like an agency and just was listening to what I would just kind of call the treatment assignment mechanism. Just kind of like, how exactly is the treatment being assigned to people? And it sounds like you just have an ear for randomness, first of all, but this kind of humility, you're like, just I'm gonna go talk to these people. I think like what that's not always what uh, not every economist has that reputation. They just kind of download the data set and but it seems like you're out there talking to people. Is that accurate?
My best ideas have come from listening to the people who actually assign the treatment. Like, how does this happen?
Right.
And I'm definitely always listening for, what could be a good shifter of a shock to getting that treatment. So that applies to my healthcare research for sure,
Sure.
and this child welfare research too.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's my advice to grad students. Yeah, is to get out of your office and talk to people who are in the setting where you're interested in. If you're interested in employment, then go to an employment office and
Yeah.
see how they're trying to help people. You can just get ideas anyway.
Yeah. 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 I remember like the one thing is I think it's like, well, a lot of people really like, nobody's really curious about their job. And so a lot of people enjoy, talking to a student who's genuinely curious about like an unbelievable amount of minutia. I mean, like it doesn't have to be like I had that too. I was working on the mental health courts in Travis County, and I was I was taking this public defender out to for burritos, and just kind of being like, okay, walk me through again, just exactly how do you get into mental health court? Like, why are they going to mental health court? Obviously because they're mentally ill, but like, what is exactly happening? And then, you can't ask them what's a good instrument, because you have to just kind of, they don't even know what to tell you. So the only thing I just figured out is like, I need you to walk me through the treatment assignment. And sometimes you'll be surprised. They'll say, oh, there's a when they're in jail, there's a score that they're given, and we only take people above a certain number. And you're like, oh my gosh, that's this was worth every burrito that I just bought you. So I mean, it's I always tell students that too. Is just how important it is just to go out there and listen. Um, you just don't, just kind of like cast a wide net and just listen.
Yeah.
It's really, it's a big part of research when you're not doing randomized trials, Great. Well, it's such a pleasure, Joe, to meet finally face to face. I've been such a big admirer of your work for a long time because I love the leniency design. I'm like the last person to even learn it. It's like there's now like 5 million papers that do it. You got to be the first guy to do it, but I also used to write on foster care, and I just read those papers so closely, and I just really enjoyed it. So it's really neat to meet. And I really appreciate you giving me an hour of your time.
No, I'm a big fan of your podcast here, and so it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks.
Great. Okay. Well, you have a great day.
Gonna see us through.